And so you venture forth unto the unknown.
Bro, damn Emet-Selch as the narrator for these new zones.
Beyond the horizon that cannot be divined. A future undefined and in flux.
Oh my god. I'm not even out of the bloody shore yet and I'm already mind blown. What's the meaning of that though? There's gotta be a reason for that. Talk about ominous. Wow, dude, I'm so... Alright lads, it's time to talk about Emet-Selch. What a phenomenal character. Played his role as a villain to perfection and an absolute icon within the FF14 story. So, about 2 years ago I made my first character analysis video, which was basically the first actual video I made about FF14, which started my passion to start making content around this game. Well, in the video I explained that what really sparked me to do it was the success of Shadowbringers, and specifically this Japanese poll that showed Emet-Selch ranking at number 6 of all-time best Final Fantasy characters among 500,000 Japanese voters. This was huge because for those of you who only played FF14 from the series, there's a lot of really iconic characters from this franchise, so for FF14 to rank that high with this one character was honestly mind-blowing. And that got me interested in making these videos where I analyze these characters and discuss what made them awesome. And trust me, I do want to make a video about Emet-Selch eventually as well. Given I said this, it might seem a little strange that I never made a character analysis on Emet-Selch, given you could say that it was basically because of him that I got into YouTube. The reason was that I wanted to wait until I got better at making these videos until I would cover him, because I saw him as a really important character. Of course, I am still making an effort to improve with each video, so there's definitely tons of more room for me to grow still, but I think I have become decent enough that I wish to tackle the character now. I'm also glad I waited because being able to include Endwalker is huge. And yeah, obviously this includes Endwalker spoilers. This video will also be quite lengthy and significantly longer than my recent uploads, so I understand this will be a lot of work for much less traction. My reasoning is that, quite frankly, I don't think 15 minutes is justified for a character like Emet-Selch. There is so much to discuss when it comes to him. I want to work without a time restraint. So, in reference to the poll earlier, what made Emet-Selch so popular as a villain?
Finally you asked the right question.
One could say, oh well, it's simply that he was well written, or people thirsting for him. I do think being well written is a condition and being hot, honestly, that too, but things usually aren't that simple. There are usually more factors to something being successful than just the quality of it. A big factor here was the fact that Shadowbringers was a very well received story and sold a lot. So we could say that Emet-Selch's success can be attributed to Shadowbringers' success. But one might also wonder, what if Shadowbringers was successful because of Emet-Selch? Now, in my Shadowbringers analysis, I discuss many of the broader points on what made that expansion successful, but if we move away from those broader topics, such as design philosophy and marketing, and look at things in a more microscopic sense, we can definitely claim that yes, Emet-Selch being such a well-written villain most likely did help solidify Shadowbringers as one of the GOATs. I think the best evidence to support this is to look at other stories. Quite often you'll find that in many of the highest rating movies, video games, books, whatever, they tend to have strong villains that make the story appealing. Usually when I hear people discuss a story, they talk about the villain more than the main characters. I think this makes a lot of sense. They have the potential to be more interesting than the heroes because the writer has so much more liberty in making them interesting, thus making them more entertaining. There's also the fact that we as humans love conflict in our stories. The really successful villains serve as great obstacles for the hero to overcome, both thematically and literally. I think something huge that played in Emet-Selch's favor was that he was the first Ascian character that was actually interesting. Up until this point, the writers basically didn't know what to do with the Ascians. They were more or less just generic bad guys doing bad and ominous things in the background. Our brains love patterns, so when we see a certain group act in a certain way repeatedly, we come to expect that behavior. So when we talk about a group, the Ascians, our expectation was always, oh, generic, uninteresting bad guys. This kind of an expectation isn't good for obvious reasons, but they actually took that and used it to their advantage when it came to Shadowbringers, because Emet-Selch was when they would shatter that expectation, and it comes as quite a shock to the player, even if it's mostly subconsciously. It's like, whoa, an Ascian that has real motivations and purpose? This was a perfect subversion of expectation, and I think it helped immensely in making people love Emet-Selch. More importantly, however, I think it was quite simply because he was the first proper sympathetic villain. The ones from past expansions could definitely be seen as sympathetic in certain ways, but what I mean in regards to Emet-Selch is that he was the first one that was written that way from the get-go. Having him be sympathetic was their actual goal, instead of having the villain be a force of nature, misguided or whatever, right? And this worked because people adore sympathetic villains. People love it when they get these minor hesitations of, wait, are they actually that bad? Or I would do the same in their shoes. Or feelings of being uncertain as to who are actually the villains and heroes in the story. It's something that always appeals to people, which sold Emet-Selch as an amazing antagonist, since that was the first time that FF14 properly offered that sensation. This is also paired with the fact that Emet-Selch also had a way more presence dedicated to him than any previous villain. I'm talking pure screen time, but even arguably the amount of effort that went into him was much higher than what came before, if we get into concrete things like the amount of voice acting, amount of screen time and so on, but I do think that him being sympathetic was essentially the key to his success. I also want to bring up a point regarding Emmet's popularity. You sometimes see in storytelling an author kills a character not realizing how popular and loved by fans that character was until after the fact. This sometimes results in the author scrambling for ways to bring them back to varying levels of success. On my first playthrough of Endwalker, I thought this was what was going on with Emet-Selch. That the writers were like, oh hey, he was more popular than we expected, let's add him in there for some fan service. But I've later reflected on it and came to the conclusion that Emet-Selch's involvement in Endwalker was definitely planned back when the Shadowbringers arc was conceived, because it's also well structured that if it was something they thought of on the spot, there would surely be blatant holes that we could spot. But that's not the case. It fits his character perfectly. Moreover, I want to mention that Yoshida did straight up confirm that it was always the intention. In fact, he even specifies that the reason we never got an Emet-Selch minion was because his story was still ongoing. So, to summarize, Emet-Selch was successful because he was well written, was part of a rather successful story, and helped contribute to its success. He surprised the audience by being the first interesting character in that group of characters, and most importantly, he was a sympathetic villain.
So come, shed your preconceptions. See beyond the unscrupulous villains you take us for.
Since I brought up the sympathetic villain point, let me address something I sometimes see going on whenever people discuss this character. Emmet's villainy becomes kind of a heated topic whenever I see it brought up. This is the whole stance of people arguing, oh, he did nothing wrong, he's not really a villain, he's just an anti-hero is another one I heard, and things of that nature. This tends to happen with villains that are very sympathetic because, as I said, people's image of who are really the bad guys in the story get muddled. However, I personally disagree with this take. Let me explain what to me personally constitutes a villain or an antagonist, and keep in mind, this is just my personal take. So the first thing is what most people generally use to associate a villain, and that's basically how evil the character is. A guy blows up an orphanage? Yeah, that's an evil mofo, that's for sure someone we could identify as a villain. But sometimes this may not be enough because they might have a justification for it, right? That's when I like to utilize these other 2 points of view. The first one is perspective. This one is really easy. From whose perspective is the story told? Find their opposition and you have the villain. A really good example I can use here is Breaking Bad. In it, we follow the story of Walter White as he becomes more and more corrupted by the criminal world and by his own ego and greed, and his actions over time become harder to swallow as he does a lot of bad things, tormenting those around him and kills a lot of people. Does that make Walter White the villain of the story though? Because he did evil things? In my interpretation, no. He is still the protagonist because the story is still very much from his point of view. That's exactly the point of the story of Breaking Bad. It's a hero who goes through a negative change arc, which is when a character changes for the worse. We can pair perspective with the theme of the story, and from there figure out who is the villain as well. This is probably the most involved way because you first must identify the core theme of the story, or multiple themes. But if you have, you can then look at which character stands in opposition to this theme, because villains are often written to be the antithesis of the primary theme the story has going for it. Mind you, this may not always be the case, but generally the villain does interact with the theme in some major way, and that is indeed often by being in opposition of it. So let's have a look at Emet-Selch from all these points of view. First of all, the evil factor. He has murdered millions of people without showing any remorse or signs of stopping, so this one is a definitive yes. Most people would stop at this point, but let's go further. Let's talk about the perspective in the narrative. The story is told from the point of view of the Warrior of Light and the Scions. Does Emet-Selch stand in opposition of, or with this group? The answer here is obvious, because it's not like Emet-Selch is even a case of someone indirectly opposing the group. He is quite literally in direct opposition of the Warrior of Light and the party. And finally, thematically, he does very much stand in opposition to the message the story tries to convey, and he is in full acceptance of this after his defeat, but I'll discuss that more in detail later. So by looking at all these three factors, to me there is no doubt, Emet-Selch is a villain in this story. I know for many of you this may not be news, duh, but I just wanted to bring this up because I've seen people get into pissing contests over this so many times and it's kind of annoying. There are essentially two versions of Emet-Selch. We have the one pre-Sundering, which we got to see during Endwalker in Elpis, and then we have the post-Sundering image of him, which we got to see during Shadowbringers. Luckily, we learn a lot about both of these, so let's get into it. The pre-Sundering Emet-Selch is often described as somewhat of a tsundere. Now, for those that don't watch anime like me, you might be wondering, what the frick is a tsundere? Well, as I understood it, it essentially means someone who puts up an outwardly tough appearance to those around them, to those they are fond of in particular. We can definitely see this in Emet-Selch. He is constantly moaning and pretends to not be into stuff, yet he always follows Azem's lead and gives in to Hythlodaeus' antics. And when I say outwardly tough appearance, I mean it. He can be very hard on people and basically doesn't have a filter. I remember being shocked at some of his comments, like,
That sounds more akin to the desperate flailings of a wild beast when facing imminent death.
Emet-Selch might need a little encouragement, but once he's committed to a task, he is committed. For instance, he wasn't initially too enthusiastic about taking the seat of Emet-Selch, but Hythlodaeus implored him to go for it in his place, and so once he took up the title, he took to his duties in earnest. The awesome thing is that it was mainly thanks to Azem and Hythlodaeus he got the job. Traveling with Azem made him known around the world, and Hythlodaeus voting for him was huge, since he was the original candidate. Emet-Selch is very serious about this duty, both in a literal sense in his obligations to the 14, but also in an abstract sense. He considers it his duty to better and respect the lives of his brethren. He is particularly fond of all the customs of the ancients. For example, he advocates for returning to the star, aka killing yourself after you fulfilled your duty to the convocation. He's infuriated about having to remove his mask. He hates transforming in public due to it being shameful, and he's irritated at his robes getting wet, which is also seen as shameful. In other words, Emet-Selch not only followed the ancients' traditions, but followed them fondly. This gives an excellent backdrop for how much he actually loved said society. Emet-Selch also has an excellent ability to gaze into people's souls and thus can easily detect people, plus he's extremely good with magic, and Hythlodaeus even calls him the best there is. There is still more to discuss regarding Endwalker Emet-Selch, but I'll follow up on other sections. So let's move on to talking about the man he would become after the world as he knew it would no longer exist. The Sundering, as we know, is the event where Hythlodaeus split the world and everything in it into 14 reflections. This had a profound impact on Emet-Selch's psyche. This is how he describes the event.
When I beheld the shattered remnants of our home, I knew deepest despair. The inhabitants of these 14 fragments were feeble, frail and foolish, oblivious to their imperfection, ignorant of their past. Malformed creatures thrashing blindly about, pitiful, disturbing, depressing.
In the near crossover story, they actually elaborate on this single line of dialogue. See, one can easily infer he's simply saying they are malformed in contrast to the ancients, and I do think that was the writer's intent, given that it's a huge part of Emet-Selch's character. You know, the whole him not accepting that mankind is fit to succeed them as stewards of the star, how he considers sundered people as people that aren't truly living, and so on. However, what this near story reveals to us is that Emet-Selch wasn't being hyperbolic. Indeed, his description was as laser accurate as you can get. Those lifeforms were, initially, quite literally malformed. They could not even communicate, couldn't write, couldn't read, couldn't even speak. Just mindless creatures flailing about with next to no sentience. This is very interesting because it puts the Sundering in an even worse light than what we had previously thought. Going from ancients to the regular people we see in the game is bad enough, but it being this absolute reset button, holy crap, I couldn't even begin to imagine what it would feel like to go from 100 to 0 like that. And this is something important to understand about Emet-Selch. No one could have come out of that kind of a scenario unscathed, and I do mean no one. You would need such godly levels of mental fortitude to brush off such a sudden, traumatic, life-changing event that it's just not possible. It's honestly a goddamn miracle that Emet-Selch managed to remain functional after going through such a shock, because this kind of an incident would easily break most people, like completely shatter their psyche. So that in itself is a testament to Emet-Selch's iron will. But it also helps us understand how this disdain towards the sundered people utterly poisoned and consumed Emet-Selch. This basically gives us a new version of Emet-Selch, since the Emet-Selch we see post-Sundering is noticeably different from the one we witness in Elpis. His stature is very much that of a person who is tired of everything. He's constantly hunched back, he walks slowly, he's often sighing, one can hear the tiredness in his tone, and he often even mentions his fatigue straight up.
To accompany you is taxing enough. To fight is out of the question. I'm rather fond of sleep, you know. It's a wonderful way to pass the time.
This tiredness is caused by millennia of solitude, and his burden of carrying the entire legacy of his people weighed him down even more. Additionally, something we see in post-Sundering Emet-Selch is that he's quite fond of theatre, and indeed his dialogue reflects this at times, speaking like he's in a play. He was able to exercise this hobby during his time as Songus Zos Galvus, as he even had an entire theatre group playing his favorite performances. It's likely this acts as a sort of a coping mechanism. Given the awful experience he went through, it's easier to pretend, even if just for a moment, that it's all just fiction, an elaborate story. These moments are very fleeting though, as it does little to satisfy his black heart. Indeed, while his dialogue suggests he's very cheerful and talkative, it's all just a mask. That's just the coping mechanism of acting like he's in a play. Underneath is the utterly exhausted man I just described. He doesn't really have any interest in the unsundered world, viewing the people and their doings as insignificant. Even towards his own allies, he acts downright condescending. Another good sign of his coldness is leaving Mitron to his own devices after Ardbert struck him with a blade of light. To Emet-Selch, the Sundered Ascians are just people with fake memories, so he doesn't really care about their lives. Another coping mechanism he likes to use is denial. We see this crop up at random points. When accused of murdering millions, he denies it, citing he didn't see those people as truly living. Even though he himself can clearly see his dear friend's soul within the Warrior of Might, he's in denial about them sharing any resemblance to them all the way until the end. In Endwalker, we find out that this isn't something he developed as a result of the Sundering, rather it was something intrinsic to his character all this time. When the Warrior of Light tells their story in Elpis, Emet-Selch vehemently denies that he would ever create Amaroth. This is funny because when you meet Hythlodaeus on the moon earlier, he says precisely the opposite, saying, that does sound like something Emet-Selch would do. So he always liked to utilize this, it's just that he became ever more reliant on it after the Sundering. Though Emet-Selch retains that strong sense of duty, he does indulge in personal fantasies despite what kind of an image it has. For instance, him recreating shades of those that sacrifice themselves to Zodiac, in a way desecrating their noble deeds. He himself acknowledges in Elpis that this is a pretty questionable act and indeed denies it, which goes to show how he had fallen from grace. Emet-Selch's status as an unsundered leaves him the de facto most powerful being in the world. He rarely makes use of this power, however. He more prefers to manipulate civilizations to bring about their own downfall. In addition, he often appears meek to the party, probably to lure them into a false sense of security.
Happy to let me go, are you? Because the murderous glint in your eye suggests otherwise. Indeed, it is enough to make me think better of confronting you alone. My apologies. You will forgive me if I'm not entirely at ease in the presence of a famed Ascian slayer. I felt it only prudent to take precautions.
In general, Emet-Selch is quite cunning, which is aided by his extreme intelligence owing to his unsundered status and having lived for thousands of years. He's a schemer.
You're plotting something.
Every hour of every day. But never you mind about that. Provided I have the inclination, I can always begin anew, scheme and conspire to my heart's content.
And even his unsundered brethren described him as unpredictable and hard to read. Something that really attests to this in-game is the fact that you spend most of the story slaying Light Wardens, thinking you are ruining his plans, but he's way ahead of you and you're actually just playing into his hands the whole time. And of course, having pulled a lot of strings in the background throughout those calamities, he has a rather deep understanding of human nature. He can very easily manipulate people to play to his tune. His biggest creations, Garlemald and Allag, are a testament to that fact. So, given all this talk about being tired, depressed, basically just the sorrowful story of Emet-Selch, one might wonder, what kept him going all these years? The past, of course. Now, when we think about motivation, it could simply be described as the ability to hold a thought in your mind in the long term. You want to be healthy, so you hold that thought in your mind over a long period of time, which motivates you to exercise. If you can only hold that thought for a few weeks, you lose interest in exercising, hence you've lost your motivation to keep doing it. In this sense, Emet-Selch's only true motivation was to bring back his people. He desperately clung to this thought for thousands upon thousands of years, which motivated him to commit to the rejoinings, and it was precisely that thought which allowed him to keep going with life, to get up from bed every morning. The message behind Shadowbringers tells us that we should reflect on the past to inform the future, but Emet-Selch as a villain goes against this theme. For him, there is no future, there is only the past, which is when it gets problematic, and indeed, this is something that we generally perceive of as a negative thing in our society. Think of, for example, that famous quote from John F. Kennedy, "For time and the world do not stand still. Change is the law of life, and those who only look to the past or the present are certain to miss the future." Which, by the way, is another interpretation for what the ticking clock in the Amaroth theme and do the edge represents. Change is inevitable. This mindset tells us that those who resist change are an obstacle and go against the very rules of nature, and indeed, that's what Emet-Selch is in Shadowbringers. But we nevertheless sympathize with him because in his case, he got so thoroughly traumatized that there was no future in store for him, only the past. The want to return to better times is often rather alluring, especially if the future has nothing to offer. And it is precisely this that led Emet-Selch down a very destructive path. And this is where we get to talking about what is, in my opinion, Emet-Selch's biggest character flaw. Now, I am sure many of you would agree that it is the thing I just talked about, how he was unable to let go. However, that is merely a symptom. What is the actual cause for this behavior? Which particularly powerful emotion leads to the inability to let go? That would indeed be resentment. A feeling that something was taken from you too early and unjustifiably, and then re-experiencing those past injustices over and over. Resentment is a very strong negative emotion, and is also one of the most dangerous emotions, because when you are very deep in resentment, it will just consume everything within you. In that sense, I feel Emet-Selch as a fictive character makes for a very good representation of just how dangerous resentment can be when it's taken to its extreme. Now, why is Emet-Selch's case so severe? Well, let's stop for a sec to think about what is something quintessential, something fundamental about being human. We are born into this world and live our lives, and in the process of loving those around us, we form attachments. But nothing lasts forever, and everything must eventually come to an end. So, at the end of our journey, we have to let go of all those attachments. Therein lies the problem, however. The bigger the attachment, the harder it is to let go. But there comes a point when you have to accept the laws. The acceptance must come at some point. Without that acceptance, you'll easily succumb to resentment. So note the point about bigger attachments making it harder to accept the laws. Think of Emet-Selch as a character. He was immensely attached to the ancients. I mean, he was on the convocation of 14, and as I had just described, he loved their culture. But most notably, he had formed a deep bond with Hythlodaeus and Azem. Then we have the, from his point of view, completely unfair and unjustified destruction of his world by the Sundering. The amount he lost is beyond comprehension. The Sundering took everything from him and did so in a most traumatizing way. And finally, we have the fact that he is now the most powerful being in this new world. All these things combined make for a very dangerous recipe. In Emet-Selch, this manifested by him being unable to move on from the fate that befell the ancients, which is why he was so determined in making that memory real forever and to never let it go, and why he was so goddamn resentful. This is of course all internal. However, we do get to see him finally fully express this at the very end in scenes like this.
For eons have I measured your worth and found you wanting. Too weak and feeble-minded to serve as stewards of any star. Let us imagine that the laws of reality are again undone and the world faces true annihilation. Do you honestly believe that half your number would sacrifice themselves to save the other? Of course they wouldn't! And if you had witnessed history unfold as I have, you would reach the same conclusion. I will bring back our brethren, our friends, our loved ones. The world belongs to us and us alone.
You can feel the resentment in those lines. And sure, we can all picture it. Most of us had something happen that made us a bit resentful. But picture the worst case you had. What event had you resentful the longest in your life? and then multiply that by like 1,000. That's Emet-Selch. That's all his mind has been focused on for over 10,000 years. Constant, gnawing, pure resentment without cease. This is why Emmet's case was so drastic. The more attached you are, and the more you feel like what happened was unfair, the harder the resentment, and thus the stronger the desire to act on those conceived injustices, to the point that you do anything to relive that memory. All the suffering you see as caused by the calamities, the endless destruction of nature and human lives, is all because of one man's resentment about the laws of the ancients and his inability to come to terms with it. So, in a sense, since this goes against our very human nature, it could be said that this is exactly what caused Emet-Selch's loss of humanity. This is exactly why his assessment about coexistence being impossible in the end was spot on. The only way for Emet-Selch to be freed was for him to be defeated, and once he does get defeated, that is indeed finally the moment he lets go. He entrusts the burden that was crushing him his whole life, the legacy of the ancients, and passes it on to the Warrior of Light, which finally gave him peace, and in the process, he also redeems his humanity. And that in itself can be a powerful message. If Emet-Selch could let go, so can you. If you are feeling resentful, just know that it will get better. Eventually you will find acceptance, move on, and be able to direct your energy at more productive and healthier things. A note I do want to add on something I said earlier. When I said all the suffering is caused by Emet-Selch's resentment, of course, we do know through the Omega quests that the writers intended this to be a more complicated topic, that each person can decide for themselves whether Emet-Selch, Hermes, or Venar was to blame for all of this, or if it was perhaps just nature playing its course or whatnot. But that wasn't my point. To use an analogy, I would describe Emet-Selch as a gun. Whoever pulled the trigger is up to your own interpretation, but my point is that he is still the source of all this suffering. In this section, I would like to briefly elaborate a bit more on Emet-Selch's defeat and his subsequent redemption in the story. So, as I briefly mentioned, Emet-Selch is powerful beyond comprehension, and he may have indeed been the most powerful opponent we ever fought. Now, one might of course say, well, we defeated him, but what you have to bear in mind is that Emet-Selch's defeat didn't come easy. This is a classic case where the heroes are able to prevail over the villain only through very special circumstances. In the case of Shadowbringers, we have a lot of crucial things that played into the Warrior of Light's hand. First, we have Ardbert's timely soul merge, then Grahatia's timely summoning spell, which, mind you, only a single person in the whole universe knows this spell. Then we have Hydolen's direct intervention, which is the first time she did so since our fight against Atma Weapon and Lahabrea, and finally, all the Light Warden essence contained within the Warrior of Light that he was able to use to defeat Hades' darkness. In other words, yes, Emet-Selch was defeated, but the amount of things that had to happen for the Warrior of Light to come out on top meant that it was by no means an easy victory. Another thing I love, which echoes one of my favorite villains, Kuja from FF9, is that Emet-Selch's involvement doesn't end with his defeat. Rather, he continues on to repeatedly save you from dire situations. Like, quite literally, he saves you on 2 separate occasions, or even more than that if you want to count him bestowing Azem's Constellation Crystal to you. This further sells Emmet's graceful defeat, because he actually held on to his end of the deal, if you recall this line before the fight.
The victor shall write the tale, and the vanquished become its villain.
This also goes back to what I said about Emet-Selch being very committed to his chosen cause. Once he made that deal, and the outcome showed him to be the loser, he truly honored it. In a sense, you being able to defeat him showed to him that you are a worthy successor to his dear friend despite your fragmented state, and that you are worthy to carry on their legacy. Think about the significance behind those words, remember us. He's entrusting the memories and legacy of the ancients to you and you alone. In Endwalker, he further shows respect when he indirectly admits that he may have been wrong about the Sundered people's capability to be the stewards of this star, when he acknowledges that you were able to come this far, which his people would not have been able to achieve. This is exactly why this line,
"The future you seek is not the past we loved. That is why we fought, and why I lost. But though you defeated me, my ideals are inviolate, invincible."
works so well. This line comes so naturally we don't really think about it, but this line actually needed a lot of setup to have that payoff. It works precisely because we saw Emet-Selch act so graciously upon his defeat. I also love this line because it shows that despite him acknowledging our path was the correct one, he still holds true to his ideals to the very end. Such was his attachment to his people. I think this is also the way to go when you wanna make a redemption arc. You don't simply have those irreconcilable differences disappear and it's all happy sunshine and rainbows. Rather, Emet-Selch simply comes to accept the situation and helps the warrior fight despite their different ideals, because he nevertheless wants to see his dear friend succeed. And in the process of wanting to save the warrior flight and the star besides, he proved he was able to let go of his sorrow and his resentment, which shows us what Emet-Selch truly was all this time underneath. A man who had a tremendous amount of love for his dear friends and the star. That's how you redeem a character. Emet-Selch is an interesting character because there are some interesting things going on in the background that maybe aren't as much at the forefront, but they can nonetheless be a topic of discussion when it comes to his character. So the first factor we can look at is his actual plan to cause the Great Rejoining and bring back his people. There is a certain sad aspect to this, because whenever he speaks about it, he's like, yeah, we'll destroy these shards, make Zodiac whole, and he's gonna bring back the boys and it's gonna be awesome. Of course Emet-Selch would be certain of the plan. This is the only hope he can cling to, so naturally he 100% convinced himself that it has got to work. But when we look at it from an outsider's point of view, this plan is actually rather vague and has some issues. The first thing we have here is that the people in the source will keep getting power increases with every rejoining. So far, the Ascians' ability to cause calamities have been contingent on two things. A, people are dumb and easily manipulated, and B, people are not strong enough to raise a hand against them. Well, a key detail worth remembering is that a rejoining makes you more intelligent alongside increasing your strength. Not to mention that more people would likely start awakening to the Echo and their Echo abilities would be more powerful. So the chances of people outsmarting and or overpowering the Ascians increases every time a rejoining happens. I mean, heck, Thordan already outsmarted and destroyed La Habrea, and that was only after 7 rejoinings. And it's ironic that this was Varys' original plan, to have people become stronger to defeat the Ascians. It's doubly ironic because Emet-Selch too was defeated as a result of 2 people's efforts who were both 8 times rejoined. So while I doubt that Varys would have been the one, I do believe that eventually people in the source would be able to destroy the Ascians. Another big question mark is the 13th. Yeah, you messed it up and it can no longer be used for a rejoining. What if you mess up another shard? What if Zodiac isn't strong enough after you rejoin all the shards but the 13th? And this is not even getting into the question of how Zodiac would actually manage to accomplish all of this, or if he indeed can even reverse the state of the world at this point, and so on. Just to clarify, I'm not bringing these up as like plot holes or anything. No, these holes in his plans are very much deliberate, because they speak to the absolute desperation of Emet-Selch and the Ascians as a whole. Another interesting thing the writers did is that they dropped this little hint in optional dialogue regarding Emet-Selch being tempered by Zodiac. It then becomes a question of how much agency did Emet-Selch actually have over his actions? Was his reasoning or recollection warped by Zodiac's influence? I even heard a theory once about how he purposefully acted villainous to have the warrior fly defeat him so he would be untempered. I personally don't subscribe to these theories, nor do I believe it's at all what the writers intended, but I bring it up because it really goes to show how much people have thought about this part of his character. And honestly, this reminds me of the Sephiroth-Genova situation back from Final Fantasy XIV, where the game never goes out of its way to flat out state who's in charge. My take on it is that yes, at some level, Zodiac's tempering may have had some influence on his thoughts, but I'm not a fan of leaning too heavily into it. First of all, this dialogue is purely optional, which already tells us it's probably not meant to be that major, and secondly, I feel like the more you lean towards the idea that everything he did was influenced by Zodiac and that he had no free will, the less interesting it actually makes Emet-Selch's character, because it would simply turn him into Zodiac's puppet. There is plenty enough explanation and motive for Emet-Selch's actions that saying he was just a puppet is completely moot as far as I'm concerned. And this is without even mentioning that Endwalker effectively debunked this theory, because if he was under Zodiac's spell all along, surely he would have made mention of how he suddenly has agency over his actions. The next point is questioning the veracity of everything that Emet-Selch tells you about the Ancients. This too is something that isn't as relevant anymore now that Endwalker is out, but I always found this to be an interesting topic to discuss with my friends back in the day. Basically, before Endwalker, the only source of information you had on the Ancients was from Emet-Selch. And to me, Emet-Selch always had this aura of being a potentially unreliable narrator. I have a couple of reasons for this. One is the character trait I described earlier. He is rather cunning. You hear from characters like Elidibus and Varys how unpredictable he is, and he even says to your face things such as him scheming 24/7 or how you'd never be able to catch him in a lie. This kind of stuff then sort of just sits in your subconscious, and so every time you learn something about the Ancients, you are sitting there like, is that really it? The other element is the one I just discussed, him being tempered by Zodiac. Again, I personally don't lean much into it, but it's another potential thing to mention. But thirdly, and this was always to me the most convincing, is simply the amount of bias. Emet-Selch has all the reason to speak about the Ancients fondly, and only fondly. It's like when you talk to someone who is really patriotic, they aren't going to tell you the negative sides of things. They won't tell you about their country's atrocities, the corruption, or things like that. No, they'll only mention all the things that are awesome about the country. It essentially makes you ask, were their society really this perfect, or is it simply that is how Emet-Selch perceives it due to his rose-tinted nostalgia goggles? In that sense, Emet-Selch could simply be telling you a sort of a biased truth, so rather than falsifying information, he simply omits it, whether consciously or not. I always loved this aspect of Emet-Selch's character because it adds a certain complexity to the situation, and even with Endwalker out, where you discover stuff about the Ancients in Elpis, it still works because if one does question the reliability of Emmet's narration, it keeps them in suspense until they get to Elpis and find out for themselves. Obviously, those who finish the story know that yes, in the end, Emet-Selch's narration was reliable, but it's nevertheless a cool thing that keeps you in suspense until you find out. The final element I want to bring up here is Emet-Selch's relation to the Sundered people. We can sort of infer that this thing of him hoping that the Sundered people would show themselves worthy wasn't something he thought of for the first time in Shadowbringers. This was probably the most involved he was, but it's likely that this thought may have always been at the back of his mind. There's dialogue to suggest this.
Look at me! I have lived 1,000 of your lives. I have broken bread with you, fought with you, grown ill, grown old, sired children, and yes, welcomed death's sweet embrace.
So yeah, it implies he has actually put in the effort to try and see if the Sundered people are worthy. However, due to that sheer resentment I described earlier, I would assume his attempts were usually akin to him handing people the key to a nuke and then is disappointed when they nuke each other. He's essentially instigating their destruction by building these empires that gravitate towards self-destruction and give people tools to destroy each other, but while he's doing it, he's hoping that they wouldn't do it. Of course, there's two ways of looking at this. One is to say, well, it's completely fine because if these people could truly surpass the Ancients, they would resist the urge to do anything for their own greed. But on the other hand, he's basically rigging the game that he himself set up and then is upset by the results. I feel like there is an intentional parallel here between Emet-Selch and Hermes, because when Hermes wanted to test the Ancients' right to exist, he went out of his way to try and make the test as fair as he possibly could. Emet-Selch is the direct opposite of that, where he is testing the Sundered people's right to exist and goes out of his way to make it as unfair as possible.
I haven't the foggiest what you're talking about. That's odd. It's right here.
A bit thin in the ether, but there's no mistaking it. The color of its soul is almost identical to Azem's. Do you suppose he created it? Rather unusual for a familiar to have a soul, though.
Don't ask me. All I know is that it's trouble. Doubly so if it's his spitting image. Who do you take me for?
Why, a dear friend, of course. One who wouldn't let acts of kindness, such as my accompanying him on errands to far-flung outposts, go unrewarded?
I think it would be folly to make an analysis on Emet-Selch and not talk about some key figures that affected his character. A character this big naturally had many characters that were a part of his story. Varys, Lahabrea, Elidibus, Venar, Hermes are a few that come to mind. But I am sure we can all agree that the true stars of this show are Hythlodaeus and Azem. So let's talk about these two individuals a bit more and how they relate to Emet-Selch. Going into Endwalker, most of us knew there existed a connection between Emet-Selch and Hythlodaeus. There was the oddity of him being this strange creation among the Amarotheans, who seemed to be conscious of the fact that it was all a mirage. He spoke fondly of Emet-Selch, shared his soul color side ability, and then we of course had the side story that further explored their friendship. But Endwalker itself really blew it out of the water when it finally came time to show their relationship. It was amazing. Stout Helm has a video on Hythlo, which you guys should totally watch if you haven't already, titled Why Hythlodaeus is the Greatest Friend Ever. This title sounds like clickbait, right? But it really isn't. Hythlodaeus really is the greatest friend ever. Hythlo is one of those characters where the developers really hit a home run. This dude is straight up simply loved by everyone, and I am in full agreement with that sentiment. Honestly, he's probably my favorite supporting character of all time. What makes him so phenomenal? Well, first we have simply how well the devs executed the whole best friend ever aspect. He's super friendly, charismatic, likable, selfless, funny, and has really strong chemistry with those around him. I think the person voice acting him and the people writing his dialogue simply nailed it. He is essentially the ultimate friend. He himself even mentions how he wishes only to serve as a supporting pillar to Azem and Emet-Selch, and he's completely content with his existence and playing that role. Also, just like Emet-Selch, Hythlodaeus too loved the Ancients' way of life. He is the first one to step in to explain to Hermes why returning to the star is such a beautiful thing, and this leads me to Hythlo's contribution to the story. Hythlodaeus materializes why Emet-Selch became so resentful. He's so pure that losing someone like that is really tragic, someone that didn't deserve all of this. I've heard Hythlodaeus described before as being to Emet-Selch what Orchephon was to us, and I think that's a spot-on assessment. He plays a key role in selling Emmet's downfall by adding that human element and showing us exactly what were those attachments he couldn't let go of. Would you do the same if you had an absolute shadow of a friend like Hythlodaeus? I also like the fact that often in stories, the sympathetic villain's downfall is caused by them losing a loved one, and that loved one is often either their lover or their child. I like the fact that Hythlodaeus and Azem are simply his friends. It tells us that you don't need to be related by blood or have a romantic attachment to have an extremely powerful bond with someone.
It has been a while, Hythlodaeus. You look well.
Less so, Emet-Selch. I dare say the lines upon your brow have both deepened and doubled in number. A shame for one so young. You must make an effort to frown less often.
Easier said than done, thanks to your unruly successor.
How is she, if I may ask?
Incorrigible as ever. Rushed headlong into a volcano on the brink of eruption just the other day.
Azem is an interesting character simply because of the fact that it's this super important, prevalent character, yet they don't even have a model nor a single line of dialogue. But I think that's precisely why Azem works so well. Tying the main villain to the blank slate protagonist was a brilliant move. They give you these tiny snippets of their relationship to Emet-Selch. Like, I love it when Emet-Selch first sees you in Elpis, he gives you a quick gaze and then looks away. I bet he's thinking to himself, oh, for the love of, what kind of a scheme is Azem setting up this time? Maybe if I ignore it, I won't have to get involved. And when they theorize it's Azem's familiar, they don't even question it. It's like, yeah, that's something Azem would do. And from there, the player can self-insert their Warrior of Light's behavior into Azem, and it works beautifully. The amount of fan art of people sliding their Warrior of Light into funny stories with Emet-Selch and Hythlodaeus is a testament to that. When the developers were asked what Azem was doing all this time, their answer was basically, well, just picture what your Warrior of Light would have been doing.
So what the Azem who took over the seat from Vinod did during the final days is a secret. So we do sort of have an idea what they were up to, but we're not sure if we'll have a chance to talk about that in the future. However, I also think because you are all the Warriors of Light yourselves, probably what you imagine when you think, okay, if I was Azem, what would I have done if Vinod had told me this? That's probably pretty close to the truth. For instance, we have people saying, I don't know, play around with housing, like do some mahjong. If you think so, then yeah, that's probably what happened.
I could see some people not liking it and wanting to see the actual Azem in game, but I think the way they did it was the absolute best way of pulling this off. And then we have of course Emet-Selch eventually accepting you as Azem's successor. I adore the fact that he made a constellation crystal for you in secret, just because he was that fond of you. And I think the way they had Emet-Selch give you clues about all these places you've yet to visit is a brilliant way to wrap it all up. He's basically giving you a nod of approval. The sentiment is essentially, yeah, you earned to stand on equal footing to my dear friend. As a parting gift, here's some PogChamp ideas and places for you to explore. This also shows Emet-Selch's amount of trust in Azem / the Warrior of Light. Like, think about it, right? Emet is the only character in this whole setting who has witnessed all of this stuff. If the Warrior of Light were to fail, all that knowledge would be lost. So he's pretty much having full faith in you being able to discover all of this yourself instead of needing him to pass on all that information. Tying Azem / the Warrior of Light into Emet-Selch also works because of certain parallels. So you have the classic connection between the hero and the villain. I would say the most striking is the fact that they both share an insanely taxing burden that would break almost anyone.
I am Hades, he who shall awaken our brethren from their dark slumber.
Alright, let's move on to talking about some symbolism, cause there's quite a bit of it in Emet-Selch's design. To begin with the most apparent, let's talk about his true name, Hades. This is the one that probably most of you guys catched on to. Hades is one of the gods of ancient Greek, and he's actually one of the 3 major Olympian gods. Or one could say he's one of the 3 OGs. Sorry, that was pretty bad. Hades was the invisible god of the underworld that dealt with afterlife, as opposed to Zeus being the visible ruler of the heavens that dealt with life. This is so on the nose in 14 that the ancients even called the livestream / ethereal sea the underworld. So the connection is obviously Emet-Selch's mastery over the livestream, as demonstrated when he plucks Y'shtola with the snap of a finger, or just the fact that he's an insanely powerful mage. Though one can also think of other things, such as how you enter the dark underworld, aka the Tempest, into a city of dead people that Emet-Selch commands. Now, despite its obviousness, I think this one is nonetheless very clever with how it was executed. It's also worth noting that this was the first time they name-dropped an actual ancient Greek god, which in itself is meant to symbolize Emet-Selch's status of being an ancient. Next, we have his constellation crystal, the Gemini. So, the Gemini is symbolized by the celestial twins, and so a Gemini's personality is believed to have an intrinsic duality. This might lead to them being misinterpreted as being two-faced, yet a Gemini rarely has a hidden agenda. This basically plays into how, for most of Shadowbringers, we keep doubting Emet-Selch's intentions despite the fact that he's actually laying his thoughts wide open. These were from Shadowbringers. Now the next two are from Endwalker, where we meet Emet-Selch as he was pre-Sundering, and thus he gets a new design. The most notable differences between the Endwalker and Shadowbringers design are the eye color and the hair. So as for the eye color, when we are in Elpis, each of the four major ancients have a distinct eye color. Hythlo has purple, Venat has blue, Hermes has green, and Emet-Selch has yellow. This seems like a very deliberate choice, so most likely each of these colors symbolize something. Of course, the colors have dozens upon dozens of interpretations, but I believe that Emmet's yellow eyes relate to remembrance. It is thought that the color yellow stimulates the left side of our brains, and that the left side of our brain controls the verbal expression of our long-term semantic memory, which is why, upon seeing an autumnal picture with a lot of yellow shades, it can trigger nostalgia. Mind you, the science on this isn't exactly proven yet, but it is nonetheless known that the color yellow is often associated with remembrance and memories. This is of course very fitting to Emet-Selch, which is what I believe his eye color represents. Finally, his hair. Now, this is very interesting because Natsuko Ishikawa was asked in an interview if there's a meaning behind the white streak in Emet-Selch's hair. The interviewer proposes an interesting viewpoint that it's perhaps related to the light/dark motifs prevalent throughout Shadowbringers, but Miss Ishikawa's response is interesting. Maybe you will find out why, and perhaps you won't. Emmet's hair is like that for a reason though. This confirms that there is indeed a deeper meaning behind it rather than just, oh hey, this hair looks cool. I personally believe she was alluding to Endwalker when she said that. In Endwalker, we see that his hair is fully white before the Sundering, but most of the white is gone in Shadowbringers, however a tiny amount still remains. Therefore, it most likely symbolizes Emet-Selch's fall from grace following the Sundering. He was damaged beyond repair and his personality became darker, hence most of his hair becoming of a darker color. The white part of his hair could simply be described as the amount of humanity in him. When we meet him in Shadowbringers, most of it is gone, but when we summon him at the end in Ultima Thule, he appears in his original form, indicating he has accepted his situation and regained his humanity. In this context, you could replace humanity with a lot of other things, goodness, light, acceptance, whichever strikes your fancy, but for me, having the whiteness in his hair describe his humanity seems fitting.
Remember. Remember us. Remember that we once lived.
Emet-Selch is an amazing character and his spot among the most liked characters in the franchise is well deserved. He is the perfect villain for FF14's story. He is competent, cunning, really charismatic and overall just super entertaining to watch. His dialogue and the delivery of his voice lines nail this tired, lonely, resentful old man with an unbearable burden weighing him down for millennia. The dialogue and voice acting on this character are nothing short of immaculate. The amount of effort from the developers show, even things like his unique walking animation or his unique emotes such as his wave and finger snap. I mean, is there anything more iconic in FF14 than that snap? I would honestly liken it to something like Kefka's laugh from FF6 in terms of just being so freaking iconic.
Oh shit! Give it a little snap! Wait, Emet-Selch snaps. Did he just pull on Emet-Selch? Look at this guy. It's the boy, Pythorlus. He just pulled an Emmet. He's Emet-Selch. No! It's Emet-Selch! Wow! It's Emet-Selch!
I love how the writers are even aware of how memorable those animations are, which is why in 5.3 they had him appear in his ancient form, and we relied on those hand gestures to identify him. Brilliant. Anyway, I want to wrap up here. I could ramble on about Emet-Selch forever, honestly, but I think I've done enough gushing. In summary, Emet-Selch is a core part of what makes the Hythlodaeus/Zodiac story so incredible. Now, as for the other ancients, I want to cover the other two Unsundered eventually, once we learn more about them through Pandemonium. I would definitely be excited to talk about Venat or Hermes as well, but man, this video took ages to make and I want to chill for a while. So those guys will more likely be covered in the lead up to my Endwalker analysis. Well, that's been all. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and feel free to subscribe for more in-depth analysis such as these in the future. Have a nice day.
Remember that we once lived.